guys, it's Aoife from Words of Clover and I'm here today to do my September wrap up. I read 12 books in September. A lot of them were really good and I'm going to tell you all about them now, starting with What It's Like to Be a Dog and Other Adventures in Animal Neuroscience by Gregory Berns. This is a book that has been on kind of like my NetGalley list for quite a while, and it's one that I've always been really interested in, and I eventually picked it up and I ended up really enjoying this. I think it's a really interesting non-fiction look at how animals' brains work, but told in a way that is quite informative, yet at the same time, like, a lot of it is like project based and working with different animals and seeing how they respond to different circumstances, and I just found it really fascinating. There were some like kind of bad reviews on Goodreads and stuff about this book when I was looking at it, and some people were giving out the fact that it's not really like a complete dog-based book. People were saying, like, you know, don't pick this book up if you just want to read about dogs. The dogs are only like a small part of this book, and it kind of annoyed me in a way because like the yes, while of course the cover art is of a dog, and a dog is probably, a picture of a dog is probably more likely going to make people pick it up, as well as leading with the fact, you know, how a dog thinks, and it's probably going to make more people pick it up. But it does say, and other adventures in animal neuroscience, and you're following other animals such as seals, dolphins and Tasmanian devils, which I thought was really interesting. And I feel like I found out a lot more about seals and about like Tasmanian devils that I never really knew before, as well as about the history and kind of the myth around the Tasmanian tiger, which may or may not be extinct, like if you believe certain people, like they haven't actually been seen in a very long time. The author did actually like get to examine Tasmanian tiger brains that were like obviously kept in storage for a really long time in different museums, and that was just fascinating. Like there was this real thing around giving dogs the choice to go into the MRI machine, teaching them like in the safest way possible that it's not a scary thing, and you know, it's not something that, you know, not forcing them, not like dragging them in. It's like something that they're trained to do, that, you know, it's all reward or toy based, and yeah, just respecting the animal's decision of whether they wanted to go into the MRI machine or if they didn't, and if they didn't, they weren't forced. And I just really appreciated that line of it as well. There is one bit in it where the author is talking about his time in medical school, and where they had to perform a very cruel experiment on an animal that was alive, and it was a dog, and he talks about this experience, and it's definitely not nice to read about, but I really appreciated the fact that the author came clean with it and talked about this experience and talked about the guilt he still feels to this day about partaking in this experiment, and how cruel and awful it was, and how, you know, if he could go back he would never have done it. And I just really appreciated that. Like, he didn't have to put that in, but he did. And yeah, and just to say that they were like, you know, we have come away when we're talking about like animal science and animal experiments and stuff like that, where, you know, there's still a lot of like, he does talk about the fact that like there's the amount of like mice and rats and stuff in laboratories, and how they're treated, and the millions of them that die every year, often in cruel ways. It's quite upsetting to read about, but he actually talks about all these facts as well, which I just appreciated as well for putting in. You know, you can't really, when you're talking about animals and science, you can't really forget the fact that so many animals are abused every day because of science. So yeah, I just appreciated all of that being put in there too. So I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I read was an audiobook, and that was The Glass Hotel by Emily St. John Mandel. This is kind of like a prequel to Sea of Tranquility, which I read a couple of months ago. And well, it's not really a prequel, it's more of like the Sea of Tranquility is kind of, it's, you know, you see some characters that were in the Glass Hotel appear in the Sea of Tranquility. And this one is kind of interesting. We are following basically a Ponzi scheme, and this guy who is the leader of this Ponzi scheme, he basically tricks all of these people out of like their pensions and out of investment funds, and we just are seeing kind of like this Ponzi scheme, and then all of the people kind of affected by it in different ways, including one of the people who was affected by it was the man who did all of this. His wife Vincent was innocent of it. She didn't know about the Ponzi scheme, but we see how her life is affected by it, and how there is this mystery around her disappearance off a cruise ship a few years later. And we kind of saw that story kind of be repeated a little bit, or like talked about in Sea of Tranquility. So it was really interesting for me, having already read that, to come back and see what actually happened. So yeah, this was like okay. It was it was kind of a more like this character study. It's a slow book. I do really like how Emily St. John Mandel paces her writing. I think she always just paces it really nicely, and while I listen to this one, I can kind of think that it's probably really nicely laid out on the page, as her novels tend to be, which means that they're really kind of fast and easy to fly through. This isn't the most like action-packed novel, so you know, there's times it could be not quite boring, but there'd be like kind of a lull in things, and you really kind of have to pay attention to what's going on so you don't kind of wander off a little bit, especially with listening to it. But I still did find myself attached to some of the characters, really interested in what had happened to them, and you know, the decisions that they made in their lives. I felt really obviously sorry for a few of them who were really badly affected, and what they had to go through. So yeah, this was a 3 out of 5 stars. It wasn't amazing, it wasn't my favourite Emily St. John Mandel by any means, but I'm glad I read it, and I'm looking forward to whatever she comes out with next. And then next I read Factory Girls by Michelle Gallen. Now I've read another book by Michelle Gallen called Big Girl Small Town a few years ago, which I really enjoyed, and this one is her second book, and it is also set in a Northern Irish town in the 90s, I think it was. And we are following a girl called Maeve. So we're following a girl called Maeve. She has just finished up her schooling, and she's basically waiting for her exam results to come out, which will determine if she's able to go to the university she wants to go to. All Maeve wants to do is just get out of this town. She is sick of this small town. She's sick of, you know, living in the Troubles, and having to be afraid all the time, and having to deal with bombs and soldiers and IRA, and you know, the tensions between Protestants and Catholics in the town. She's just kind of sick of all of it. She gets a job with some of her friends so she can, like, you know, just save up money. She ends up getting a flat in town as well, so she starts living a more independent life. And in the factory that she's working in, she's actually working side by side with some Protestants in the town, which she's never really done before. She's never actually, because normally around this time Protestant and Catholics were very, very separate, obviously because of the sectarianism like going on in Northern Ireland at the time. And it's the first time she really is like conversing and getting to know Protestants and the different things that they do in comparison to Catholics. So like a lot of books like set in Northern Ireland can't be compared to Dairy Girls, but this is really like, Maeve in this is very much like Michelle in Dairy Girls. If Michelle was given her own novel, it would be Maeve. Like, Maeve is foul-mouthed. She like loves like a bit of like hooking up with the lads. She loves like tight tops, showing her boobs off. She loves like drinking. She loves a smoke. Like, she's just very, very like funny and brash and loud in a lot of ways like that. But at the same time, she's like quick in terms of being really, really smart. She's aware of ways in which she's not as privileged as maybe some of her friends, and we see some of that come out in this book as well, like kind of in terms of privilege and money and like wealth, and how it can make such a big difference. It's just a really fun book for me. I just really enjoyed it. I enjoyed spending time with Maeve. This is obviously, as I said, she's quite brash. She curses a lot. There's like a lot of vulgar like language in this as well, so if you're not really into that, don't pick it up. Big Girl Small Town was like that as well, so it is just like Michelle Gallen's style of writing. It's always really interesting reading books set around Northern Ireland around the time of the Troubles. This is kind of in the later end, where there is about to be a truce between the IRA and the English forces. So there's almost like a wave of, right before that truce, there's almost a wave of killings. So like all these killings can be done, like these assassinations can be done before the truce, and that was just like thinking of living through that time must have been just so terrifying. So yeah, I really enjoyed this and would definitely recommend for people to read if they think it's a book that they would enjoy. So I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read An Offer from a Gentleman by Julia Quinn. This is the third Bridgerton book, and it is focused on Benedict. This is actually kind of fun because it is a Cinderella retelling, having a young girl called Sophie who is basically being made to work as a maid in her stepmother's household, and they treat her really, really badly. And then one day she gets the chance to secretly go to one of the Bridgerton balls where she meets Benedict, and they have this kind of magical moment between them. But then things happen when she gets home, and she ends up having to run away, and a few years later, out somewhere else, she ends up meeting Benedict again, but he doesn't recognise her because obviously when she was at the ball she was all dressed up, she had a mask on, and he like doesn't recognise her, but she recognises him. And through circumstance she ends up having to care for Benedict when he gets ill, and like obviously a bond forms between them, but Benedict is kind of stuck because he keeps thinking about this woman that he met a few years ago at the ball, which he had this magical connection with, and he really wants to find her again. But then he obviously finds himself having feelings for Sophie, so he's torn between this mysterious woman and then Sophie, who's right in front of him, but also Sophie, who appears to just be like a lady's maid and isn't part of like the nobility whatsoever. And you know, if he was to be with her, he would also be like marrying down, if you know what I mean. So he feels like he can't do that. So yeah, this was just fun. Like the Bridgerton books are always quite fun. This is probably my favourite one so far, but this is also that I don't have like the TV show to, because I do think generally I enjoy the TV show more, and I enjoy the way the stories come about in the TV show and the fact that it is a lot more like rounded when it comes to the cast and other stories going on. And I didn't have that comparison when I was reading this one, but I did end up enjoying this one, I feel, more than I enjoyed the other two. But I also really like Benedict as a character. I find him just really lovely and interesting, and kind of different in the fact that he's not like an older daughter or an older son. He kind of has a little bit more freedom in a way to do what he wants. I did really love, we got kind of some snippets of Colin and Penelope in this, and particularly like around Penelope and her feelings for Colin and how Colin thinks of Penelope. And I just really enjoyed those moments, knowing that their book is coming next, but also what we know about Colin and Penelope from the TV show as well. I just think they're like a really cute couple as well, so I just really enjoyed seeing those little bits too. There are some bits at the end of this that go like are a little bit like ridiculous and like funny, but like I also really loved the mother. So it's Violet Bridgerton. So the mother of all the Bridgerton children, she really comes into her own in this book, and we see her force of nature personality come through, and also her caring motherly nature, where she really cares for Sophie, even though Sophie, like, she doesn't have to care for Sophie because Sophie, you know, is, you know, not even of like their ranks technically from what they know, but she cares for her in such a lovely way, and really kind of encourages Benedict to follow his heart, which, you know, you very rarely see in like you know, fiction or media around this time. Like normally, like they're told to, they have to marry certain people. To see a mother say no, like marry someone that you love is such a big difference. So yeah, I did really enjoy this one, and I gave this one, I think I gave this one a 4 out of 5 stars or 3.5. Really good. Definitely my favourite so far. And then unfortunately I had a little bit of a disappointment. I did have a physical copy of this, but I've since given it to my dad, as I think he will actually quite enjoy it, and that is Haven by Emma Donoghue. Emma Donoghue is one of my favourite writers. I really love the fact that she writes different type of stories all the time, but I just found myself very disappointed in this one. This is set in like 7th century Ireland, so very early Christianity Ireland, and we are following the journey of 3 monks from this monastery who basically all set out on this adventure to try and find this isolated island where they can set up their own monastery, and you know that they can be kind of on their own with the wilderness and God, and see what happens. And they end up finding Skellig Michael, which people kind of know of now because it is where they based where Luke was in the Star Wars movies a few years ago. It's where like Luke was hiding, and it's become like kind of a famous, it was always kind of a famous tourist site, but it's become even more of a famous tourist site now because people want to go there to see like where Luke was. I didn't really enjoy this one. I just didn't connect to it at all. I felt it very slow, quite boring at times. Now it's very heavily focused obviously on like the rituals of Christianity and like kind of trying to survive in the wilderness, and like I kind of liked the wilderness bits of it, even though I did find there was a lot of like killing of the birds and the baby birds and stuff on the island, which are now, I think they're now protected, the puffins and Skellig Michael. So it was kind of hard to hear about the fact that they kept being eaten and kept being killed, and I think there was just so much of it, it kind of got to me. If it was just a little bit, I would have been fine, but the fact that there was like a lot of like repeated moments about the birds being killed and eaten, it just made me sad. And then there was also just the thing of like the monk who was kind of leading, who became kind of the abbot, I guess, or the friar. Yeah, the abbot, so like the leader of the 3 monks who was leading the journey. He became one of these really annoying characters where everything that happened, it was like, oh well, God will provide for us, God will show us what to do, instead of actually taking initiative and like doing things that will actually help you survive, and putting the others in danger because of his thing of like, oh well, God will show us, God will provide, God will do this. And that just really annoys me, and I've never liked that in anything, when people are like, oh well, God will provide, and I'm like, that's kind of like, it feels like, you know, like this, the Christian version of like manifestation, you know, like I mean like manifesting, you can manifest all you want, but like nothing's ever actually going to happen unless you actually do it yourself, and a lot of that just comes down to hard work. So yeah, it's kind of like one of those things that me, it kind of just annoyed me. There was also a thing that was built up for it, the entire book, about one of the characters, and I actually thought it was different to what it ended up being. I just don't know if it was treated the way, I don't know, it just made me feel weird, the way it all came about. So yeah, I just didn't really enjoy this one at all, and I gave it a 2 out of 5 stars. I read a book that was translated from Korean, and it was called Violets by Kyung-Sook Shin, and this one I really enjoyed, but it's probably one of the saddest books I've ever read in my entire life, just because of the entire feeling throughout this entire book. Very sad, very melancholy, really worrying about the character the entire time, because you can just tell she's not in a good headspace. We are following a young girl called San, and we first follow her when she is a child, and we see that she has this really we see her kind of being rejected by people in her life from a very young age. So her father leaves when she is a baby, he just didn't want a daughter, and he ends up leaving her and her mother. Then she has this kind of, I guess you could kind of call it a queer experience with her best friend when she's quite young. They're only like maybe 8 or 9, and her friend completely shuns her after that and completely like locks her out of her life, and that really affects Anne up to the point when she is an adult. And then her mother also leaves her eventually to go to other places and leaves her alone. So we see her kind of being abandoned and rejected by a lot of people in her life. So when she is an adult, we see this really affect her. She is a very sad person who obviously suffers a lot from depression, and she ends up getting a job in this flower shop near a train station, and she becomes friends with the other girl that works in this flower shop, and they eventually become roommates and live together. And we see how this kind of helps her for a while, but this entire time it's like she doesn't know what she wants, and it's a very kind of meandering story. There's no real plot to it. We're just following this girl as she lives her day-to-day life, but we see her wondering all the time, like, what is life about? Who is she? Is she worth anything? You know, like just wondering about herself, and really kind of being really sad about everything in a way. And yeah, it's just really sad. There's kind of a mystery by the end of it, and it was just really sad, but I really enjoyed the writing at the same time, so I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. But I would go into this saying, if you were in kind of a bad mental health place in your life, I probably wouldn't recommend this, as I feel like this could really trigger moments of melancholy, of sadness, maybe of loneliness. Like there's a real emphasis on being alone and feeling lonely in this book, and feeling lonely within yourself all the time. So yeah, I would definitely kind of just caveat this like a 4-star review with saying that I feel like you need to be in a strong place within yourself to be reading this book and not be negatively affected by it. So yeah, and this book was written I think in the 90s, maybe it's set around the 90s as well. So it's like 20-30 years old by this stage, but I still really enjoyed it and I would recommend it, but just make sure that you're feeling okay within yourself before picking it up. Then I read a book called Utopia Avenue by David Mitchell. This is one that definitely, it's about music. It's about music in the 60s and 70s, the late 60s I think it is, and we are following a band that is formed in London. And we are basically just going from the time that they are formed by the manager and their struggles to make it big, and like their slow rise to the top. And yeah, this is definitely, like, if you're really into music, particularly around this time, I think you would really enjoy this one. I'm not a hugely musical person, so I say there were a lot more name drops in this that I didn't catch, but there is some like David Bowie, there was like John Lennon, the Beatles were obviously mentioned quite a lot in this one, Janis Joplin was in it, there was Leonard Cohen I think. Yeah, there was loads of musicians in this that like the fictional characters like talk to and all of that, that made it quite fun. I actually mixed David Mitchell up in this with David Nichols. I thought this was written by David Nichols, and I don't know if I would have picked it up if I knew it was by David Mitchell, because I have read stuff by David Mitchell before and I've really not enjoyed it because I just don't really get along with his writing, and I was finding this fine for most of it. And then there is a storyline that is connected with a mental health storyline in this that just went a little bit weird, kind of speculative and like science fiction-y in a way that like made no sense for the rest of the plot, and I was like, why would you throw this in? It's just really strange. So I don't know why he did it, and that's like the point where that happened and I was like, oh yeah, this is the type of David Mitchell writing that I just don't get along with. I did really love each chapter is basically, there's sections for like different like albums, I guess, from the band, and every chapter is named after a song and we see the inspiration for that song and where it came from, and I really love that story writing element of the book. I really enjoyed that. So yeah, 3.5 out of 5 stars. It was pretty good up until the weird mental health storyline, and what he did there, it just was a bit weird and just didn't fit in with the rest of the book, because the rest of the book was just like a normal historical fiction, and then he just threw in this kind of speculative bit and I was like, okay, whatever. Then the next book I read was an audiobook, and that was When the Dead Come Calling by Helen Sedgewick, and this is a kind of dark thriller mystery type, more mystery crime book set in this small town. There is a man that is found dead in the playground in this town, and obviously this offsets a murder investigation. We are following a couple of the characters in the town, including the police, like the top police detective in the town, called Georgie, and she is kind of a blow-in in the town, and she is the investigation and things that come up from that investigation bring up a lot of dirty secrets and dirty feelings in the town, which kind of are centered around maybe like homophobia, xenophobia, racism, and also there are some real deep secrets and history in the town as well that start coming out of things that happened years ago in the town, and there feels like there's this almost like supernatural horroristic element like bubbling up, like this horrible feeling in the town as well kind of happening. So this is mostly just like a murder mystery, like who did it, and this kind of the investigation of that crime, but then it's kind of offset by a slightly horror element of the history of the town, and is there stuff from the history of the town bubbling up again and infecting the inhabitants in a way. So I listened to this in an audiobook and I found it fine. I didn't really connect to this book so much. It was fine. It was very atmospheric in a way. I did find it made me feel a bit like crappy, like I didn't feel good when I was reading this book. I think because the book itself is quite dark and quite gloomy, and everything that was happening in the town and stuff, like these bad things that were happening, these bad feelings, these like racist attacks and horrible messages being like sent to people of colour and people that were different in the town, and yeah, it just made me feel a bit like I didn't really like the feeling it was giving me either. So I gave this a 3 out of 5 stars. It was good, and I think a lot of people would really enjoy this one. This is a trilogy, and while I didn't absolutely love this book, I wouldn't say I would probably actually go on and read the next book and like maybe finish off the trilogy as well to kind of see like how it all ends up and what happens, because I am interested. So yeah, I will probably read the next book eventually. But yeah, it was a 3 out of 5 stars. And then I had a 5-star read, and that was The Only Plane in the Sky, which is an oral history of 9/11, Garrett Graff. This is a book that I read physically, but I can imagine that this book would be an excellent audiobook. And I took my time with this one. This one took me about over a week to read, because I was reading it in little bits every day, and this one is a very tough read, and this is coming from me who, you know, is all the way over in Ireland, like not connected to the States at all, obviously just didn't have any personal connections to what happened on 9/11 and to anyone in, like, you know, to people that were killed or injured when it comes to the Twin Towers, but obviously as a person who was alive during this time and actually remembers those days and the confusion as a 9-year-old child, what was going on, remembering the pictures and the papers that my dad brought home, and the conversation, like our teacher the next day, because obviously when it happened it would have been evening time here, so the next day in school, my teacher at the time trying to explain to a bunch of like 9-year-olds what had happened and why it was such like a big event, and you know, kind of trying to explain a terrorist attack on a bunch of 9-year-olds in Ireland. Like yeah, I have a really strong memory of those days. So yeah, reading this was really interesting, and even for myself being so distant from what had happened, I still found myself really touched by the stories and really, you know, brought to tears by some of the recollections of people. This is obviously what it says in the tin, an oral history of 9/11. Starts from that morning and people going to work, people talking about the day, talking about the clear skies that day and what a lovely day it was, and it brings us all the way up to the days after, the weeks after the events, as people, you know, were on ground zero trying to find bodies and, you know, really dealing with the aftermath of what happened that day, and how it really did change the world when it comes to being so aware of terrorism. And yeah, it definitely did change the world. And it certainly changed air travel forever after that. So yeah, I don't want to say too much about this, but I would say, just if you find it an interesting topic or something you would like to read, I would 100% recommend it. I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. There's no way you could give this any less than 5 out of 5 stars, I feel. And yeah, definitely just a really poignant story about one of the biggest events in history, in modern history, and like, yeah, really, really good. That I read a book for the Lauren the Books book club, and that was The Kitchen Front by Jennifer Ryan. And this is a really cute kind of cozy book which is set around World War II, and where you're following a bunch of women who enter this competition to basically show how to cook with rations. And we see the competition kind of bring out, we see them compete against each other, but then eventually all become really, really close friends. And this is just a very cozy, easy breezy book. It's one I would recommend to maybe like older women in my family, like, you know, like your mom, your auntie, or your granny or something. It definitely feels like one of those books that like would be really enjoyed by people who read but maybe are like not really voracious readers, or really critically like readers who critically review. It's a book that's just meant to be enjoyed. It's an easy book to read, and yeah, it's not really there for critiquing in any way, if you know what I mean, because there are some elements of this book that are kind of light and a bit flat, and the character growth isn't really there. It's kind of like very quick character decisions and character changes that like don't really make that much sense. You don't see that like journey from A to B. It just goes from A to B really quickly, and like there's no journey in between those to make those changes and those personality changes and growth and stuff like that. But yeah, I enjoyed it. It was very interesting in terms of learning about from like a rations point of view as well. So I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars. I read a thriller called Truly, Darkly, Deeply. This was by Victoria Selman. And this is one that I was really disappointed in, actually. This is a very interesting concept. We are learning about a serial killer from a woman who was this man's stepdaughter. And we are seeing how she lived with this man, and this man was part of her life for like over, I think, like 6 years or something. And when she was a child, there was this like real fear in London because all these women were being killed, and she kind of vaguely connects the fact that like these women all look like her mother. So she becomes really kind of concerned with her mother, and that like being afraid that her mother is going to you know, be hurt. And then obviously it kind of comes about eventually that her stepfather, her mother's boyfriend, is the serial killer. And we see this like from like almost like, you know, 25 years later, where she's in her 30s now, and she's still dealing with the fact that she was raised almost by a serial killer, and how could she not know, and was there something she could have done to say something sooner to save more women from being killed. And we see her struggle with a lot of guilt. But one of the big things she also struggles with is what if he wasn't what if he wasn't the serial killer? What if he is innocent, and maybe something she did has meant that an innocent man has been put behind bars? So she's dealing with like a lot, and we kind of just see the story of the serial killer and her childhood and what happened. And that was fine. It was very like a fast read. It was like an addictive read. I read it really, really quickly, all like within like a day and a half. I had this book finished. But what I will say is this book literally didn't surprise me at any point. Everything that I expected to happen happened, and the book didn't surprise me in any single way, which meant that it ended up being kind of a bit of a flat read for me. I wanted to be surprised. I wanted there to be a twist that I didn't see coming, and it just never happened. All the surprises were very, very obvious from the start. It is a 2 out of 5 stars. I read one of my favourite books of the month, and that was The Queen's Rising by Rebecca Ross. This is a fantasy. I don't know whether I would class this as a YA fantasy, as the main character following is 17 going on 18, but it feels a bit mature for YA fantasy, but not quite mature for fantasy, if you know what I mean. It's kind of like in between the both of them. We are following a girl called Brianna who has been raised in this kind of school for girls, where they are taught how to be, where they basically excel at something called a passion. So they can choose knowledge, they can choose music, they can choose art, they can choose like drama, and after 7 years of study they become something called a passion, or they become a passion, and they go off into the world and they, you know, work their lives at the passion that they've studied. And we're following Brianna, who is studying to be a passion of knowledge, and she's struggling a lot with whether this is something that she is actually able to do. She struggles with the fact that she doesn't really know where she came from. Her mother died when she was born, her grandfather left her into the school, and she never knew who her father was. And then she ends up near the end of her time in the school getting these weird like memories where she's actually someone completely different. She becomes this man, and when she looks further, it turns out that she is actually getting memories from an ancestor, and this ends up being connected to the land of where her father is from, and the fact that this land used to be reigned by a queen, and years ago, 120 years ago, one of the queens were killed, and a king took over, and now there's this really cruel king sitting on the throne of this land, and he shouldn't be there. And she ends up kind of being brought into a rebellion plot about putting a queen back on the throne, and she kind of becomes really, really central to this plot. And I just really enjoyed this one. The pacing on this is really, really good. It is a Celtic inspired fantasy land, which I obviously loved. So all of the, like, where her father is from, in this land called Maven, all of the names and stuff are Irish, and I just really, really enjoyed that. It was just really fun for me. There was a river called Aoife in it, which is great. I'll take it. So yeah, I just thought this was really, really good. I was really addicted to the book. I just was loving my time reading this. I already have the second book. This is duology, so I already have the second book ready to go on audiobook, and I can't wait to get back into it. I really love the very, very slight romantic element in this book as well. It was very sweet. There was a little bit in the middle of this book, so in the middle section of this book there's kind of like an adoptive family element that's brought in, and so our main character, she suddenly has like an adoptive father. That relationship like is really, really strong. Like, there's real father-daughter kind of emphasis as well in this book, and that kind of comes through to the end of it. And I did feel like I would have liked a little bit more time in the middle to really establish that strong bond that is there. It kind of feels like it came about a little bit quickly, and like there's kind of reasons why they both, like, it was a quick thing for the both of them, and again as well for the brother and the sister. But I think I just would like a little bit more time in terms of building up that relationship too. I also really appreciated the emphasis on female friendship in this book, and also just kind of female power in general. Maven as a land is one that historically, while there has been a king on the throne, but that's kind of desecrating the whole idea of the throne as well. The fact that in Maven it's always supposed to be queens that are the rulers, and it's definitely a kind of a land that favours daughters over sons, and the daughters are thought to be more powerful and more favoured. And it was kind of just really nice to see that as well, because it's not something that you see that often in terms of particularly fantasy books, where daughters are definitely the most prized and the most treasured, and the fact that a father would be disappointed to have a son rather than have a daughter. So yeah, I really enjoyed that element of the book as well, and I think it just ended up really nicely. It ends up in a way that if you didn't want to read the second one, you wouldn't have to. It ends kind of very neatly, that, you know, you could just take it as one and it would be a really lovely standalone fantasy. But I do really love the characters, I really love the land, I really love the story that's built up, so I'm really, really interested in reading and excited to read the second one, which I'm going to do really, really soon, as I just feel like I want to read them all together, and just make it a really nice reading experience for me in reading the two of them near about the same time. So I'm hoping you'll be able to see my review of the second book in my October wrap up. So yeah, this was a 5 out of 5 star read for me. Really, really enjoyed this. Rebecca Ross is, after establishing herself as an author, I definitely want to read more from. I know she has another book called I think it's The Enchanted Wood, or The Enchanted something maybe, and I do believe that might have some Celtic inspiration in it as well. So yeah, definitely going to be reading that one too. And yeah, I just really love this book and I'm so glad that I read it. So that is everything I read in September. Please let me know if you guys have read any of these books, what books you read in September, were there any books that you would recommend, and I'll see you guys again next time.